Hey everybody, I have a video here for you today, and this is by request. And I've been going through some messages and comments, and really there is just one question that keeps on getting asked. If the dynastic Egyptians did not build the Great Pyramid and what we call the Sphinx today, well, who in the heck did? So today I'm going to attempt to give that my best shot. And I'm going to read a little from Graham Hancock's Magicians of the Gods and maybe a few other things. But, you know, this is difficult because the people who built these original structures did not tell us who they were. The dynastic Egyptians recorded everything, how they went to war, how they ate, how they slept, everything. But they did not document how they built the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid, their two greatest structures. So, everything that I have read coming from the 4th dynasty, Khufu and Khafre, were searching for initial plans of these sacred structures. They did not build them. They quarried at Giza, but they were just quarrying the stones and trying to replicate these original structures. That is clear to me. Now let's just read a little bit from Graham Hancock's Magicians of the Gods, and let's see if we can put an answer to this great mystery. I like hard mysteries. I have given you the history of what we call the Sphinx today. I have told you where El Dorado is just by using common sense. I have given you the true history of the most important religious relic of all time, the Shroud of Turin. I've given you the 2,000-year-old history of that, and I'll debate that with anybody in the world. But hard mysteries, this is what I like. I like challenging my mind. So I'm just going to read and put my thoughts all together on who built these. And I was going to include this in my Great Pyramid video, but that one I just want to be strictly about information. And I have made one video on the Great Pyramid, and it's one of my most popular uploads. I'll leave a link for this below. I made this 2 years ago. I have disabled comments on this. It has been infected. I'll just say the comment section has been infected, and every comment, it seems, goes to review. And I have just disabled the comments for this, but it is one of my most popular uploads, and I will leave a link for this below. But my pyramid series is going to go to Hawara next, and then up to the Great Pyramid. And I think this is just a good foreshadowing of what's going to come in that video. And a good thing to mention before I make that video, because when I go up to Giza, I'm going to attempt to tie this all together. But the builder gods, who were they? Well, let's start reading. And this comes from Graham Hancock's Magicians of the Gods. And if you like ancient history, and you haven't bought Magicians of the Gods or Fingerprints of the Gods, what are you waiting for? This is like my Bible of ancient history. Mr. Hancock is a thorough author, and people who like to debunk his work say he just puts out crazy theories, but everything he writes in his book is documented. There's a whole chapter of documentation in here. This comes from a chapter on, really, he goes into who was the lost civilization. It says, the Edfu texts make allusion to the SMD is the word, or wandering of the company of gods who initiated the civilizing project. Their leader was the falcon Horus, after whom the temple at Edfu was much later dedicated, but present also was Thoth, the god of wisdom. Accompanying Horus and Thoth were the Sibitu, a group of deities charged with specific responsibility for creation, the builder gods who accomplished the actual work of building, and the 7 sages. And the 7 sages, the ones who brought knowledge to this land we now call Egypt, the 7 sages, that is no different than the 7 Anunnaki, the 7 rays of light from the Indus Valley region. And later on, he goes on to talk about Khufu. It says, so once again, we are confronted by a report that Khufu sought out and consulted ancient documents to guide his works at Giza, whether to restore the Sphinx to its original appearance, as we are told in the inventory stela, or to build his temple in the correct way, incorporating an ancient design as the Westcar papyrus suggests. Such traditions, in my view, further strengthen the notion that whatever Khufu and the other pharaohs of the 4th dynasty were doing at Giza was more of the order of the fulfillment of completion of plans they had inherited from the time of the gods, antediluvian plans, in other words, than the implementation of some novel scheme of their own. They were, in short, playing their part in the resurrection of the former world of the gods. Moreover, the surface luminescence dating results reported in Chapter 10, when taken together with the geological arguments about the age of the Sphinx and its temples, invite us to consider that this process had originated in the flood epoch of 10,500 BC, had then lain practically dormant for many millennia, during which the ancient knowledge and archives were maintained by initiates in something like a monastery, and then got under way again perhaps as early as the 4th millennium BC, with the gradual build-up to its completion and fulfillment in the epoch of 2500 BC. And that is a fairly solid theory by Mr. Hancock, but again, with all these, that is up for speculation. But it says, the existence of such a college of initiates is signaled clearly in the Edfu texts, which speak of a long-term mission of the builder gods, who fashioned in primeval time the lords of light, the ghosts, the ancestors, who raised the seeds for gods and men, the senior ones who came into being at the beginning, who illumined this land when they came forth unitedly. The Edfu texts do not claim that these beings were immortal. After their deaths, we are told, the next generation came to their graves to perform the funerary rites on their behalf, and then took their places. In this way, through the unbroken chain of initiation and transmission of knowledge, the builder gods, the sages, the ghosts, the lords of light, the shining ones described in the Edfu texts, were able to renew themselves consistently, like the mythical phoenix. And it goes on to say, thus passing down to future traditions and wisdoms stemming from a previous epoch on earth. Another name for these initiates, and an appropriate one given the importance of Horus at Edfu, was the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. Under his name, they were particularly closely associated with Heliopolis, the sacred city where the records of the secret chambers of the sanctuary of Thoth were kept. The reader will recall that at Edfu it was the 7 sages who specified the plans and designs that were to be used for all future temples throughout the length and breadth of Egypt. So it is interesting that at Dendera, a little to the north of Edfu, inscriptions tell us that the great plan used by its architects was recorded in ancient writings and handed down from the followers of Horus, identical in all respects to the sages and the builder gods. These followers of Horus were said to have carried with them a knowledge of divine origins of Egypt, and of the divine purpose of the land, which was once holy, wherein alone, in reward for her devotion, the gods deigned to sojourn upon the earth. Mr. Hancock goes on to say this, suppose you wish to pass a message to the future, and not just the near future, but the very distant future. Would you be unwise to entrust it to writing, because you could not be certain that any civilization 12,000 years from now would be able to decipher your script? Besides, even if the script could be deciphered, the written document on which you would place your message might not survive the ravages of time. And what would you do? You would put it in megalithic stone, in a monument that time itself would fear, according to the earliest Egyptians. And further going on here, it says, we saw in Chapter 10 how the Heliopolis, Giza, Memphis area perfectly fits the bill as one of the new sacred domains that the Edfu text tells us were established at various locations by the wandering companies of gods seeking to bring about the resurrection of the former world destroyed in a flood. It is, moreover, a domain that fully justifies the description of a book descended from the sky, according to the text. A book descended from the sky. The pyramids are in the shape of Orion's belt. And we read that the book, written in the script of procession, with the pen of megalithic architecture, it compels us to look at the epoch of 10,500 BC, not an exact date because the processional clock gives us indications that are too general to allow us to specify seconds or even minutes, but quite definitively go to the epoch of 10,500 BC, i.e. about 12,500 years ago. The same general astronomical configurations that are symbolized on the ground by the great monuments of Giza would have held true for the best part of 5,000 years before 10,500 BC and for about 1,000 years afterwards. Now, I said 5,000 years before. I meant 500 years before. I just wanted to correct myself there. So that time period fits in my window of when I think the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid were built. Let's do a little more reading. Now, is this a lost civilization? Well, the Egyptians themselves record periods that precede the beginning of dynastic Egypt. There is this whole thing called pre-dynastic ruins. It just kind of gets mentioned in a general form, and it doesn't really go into detail what this is, but there's obviously an earlier period of history in Egypt. And this comes from Serpent in the Sky, The High Wisdom of Ancient Egypt. This is John Anthony West's book that he wrote over 20 years ago. It's fantastic. I highly recommend reading for those of you who still take part in this lost thing called reading here. It says, on the other hand, there is a chronological account of the Egyptians themselves. Egyptian chronological tables have been found in the course of excavations which date the founding of Egypt much earlier than the dynastic record. All the writers of antiquity who had any contact with Egypt related tales of such tables. Unfortunately, there is no tablet or papyrus that is complete upon these crucial earlier periods, and there are many inconsistencies among the sources. Nevertheless, there is an agreement in a very broad sense. The various sources postulate a long period during which Egypt was ruled by the Netters, and I guess that is a name for the creator gods. Netters, and that is where we get the name nature from. And then another almost equally long period during which it was ruled by the Shemsu Hor, the companions of Horus. The chronology is impossible to disentangle, and in some cases it depends upon the manner of calculation chosen. But the earliest calculation would place the founding of Egypt around 30,000 BC and the latest around 23,000 BC. So that is Mr. West's theory, and he takes it back a whole processional cycle back. Then, like Graham Hancock does, it says, Herodotus quotes one of his guides as saying that in Egyptian history, the sun had twice risen where it now set, and twice set where it now rises. This remark Schwaller de Lubitz interpreted as, well, let me say that name again, Schwaller de Lubitz interpreted as a description of the passage of 1.5 processional cycles. This would place the date of the foundation around 36,000 BC, a date in broad agreement with other sources. And that is up for speculation. I'm just, producing a theory here by one person who I really respect. Do I think it goes back that far? No. And I'll tell you when the pyramid and the Sphinx were built. Now, this is the Dendera Zodiac, probably the most famous zodiac, coming from the earliest Egyptians. This was found down at the temple, I think, of Hathor at Dendera, a very ancient place, and I think this tells a story. These falcon-headed beings, I believe these are the companions of Horus, the Shemsu Hor, written about in really legend from a previous time in Egypt, pre-dynastic period. And I had a question. Can you read hieroglyphs? From my last video, people were wondering if I can read hieroglyphs. Yes and no. I can decipher them, but it takes a heck of a lot of time. I know what some symbols mean. and some of them I have to go back and reference. And then when putting together a whole complete set of hieroglyphs, you need to kind of look ahead to determine what the previous one means, and it takes a lot of time. Maybe a group of 20, 25 symbols will take me 10 minutes to decipher, but I can do it. It just takes a lot of time. I have a few questions on that, and it's something I'm getting a tiny bit better at, but it's really complicated, and the way that you, kind of the standard way they say to read them is, in my opinion, not really the total way to read them. It's kind of complex, but I just thought I would mention that. But this is the Dendera Zodiac. And this is the greatest clue when the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid were built. This is what the dynastic Egyptian culture evolved out of. Some of the symbolism remained the same and was refined by the dynastic Egyptians. But what is at the center of their timepiece? It's the great god Anubis, the original god of Giza, the one that is written about in ancient texts that was guarding the necropolis. He is the original god of Giza. Osiris became the god of Giza roughly, I think, about 4,700 years ago. And what became of the ancient Anubis shrine? That is anybody's guess as far as how that was either taken apart. But when gods changed in Egypt, and this is clear all the way through dynastic Egyptian, the previous symbols or monuments are destroyed, sometimes by the next pharaoh even. So the Anubis in the middle of this dates the building of the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx to roughly 11,750 years ago, in my opinion. Give or take, I'd say 250 years. You go back that far, there's a hell of a window. But this fits in Graham Hancock's 10,500 BC alignment, because he said it goes back 1,000 years previous to that. So people say I'm kind of in disagreement with Graham Hancock as far as, things about the Sphinx. No, the time period matches. There's a pretty big window there. But the god of resurrection, Anubis, it was put into very personal tales of resurrection, and then it also represented the resurrection of a people that were almost wiped out by a disaster that we know for sure happened 9,600 BC, roughly. Seen some of these original structures. There was attempts to block them up and kind of bury what was down below. Perfectly matching Göbekli Tepe from the same exact time period. They were doing some sort of calculations up there, and then they buried the site. And is there any connection between Göbekli Tepe and the Great Pyramids? Well, the Sabians, pretty much, are what the dynastic Egyptians was to whoever this was down in Egypt building these original structures. The Sabians kind of evolved out of Göbekli Tepe the same way. They made pilgrimages down to the Great Pyramids all the time. And it seems when the Egyptian thing was falling apart 2,000 years ago, they took some records up to ancient Haran, the Hermetic records. So I think there is a clear connection. Ancient Anubis is at the center of the zodiac. Time spirals out. This is roughly around the start of Cancer, maybe, but I'm thinking it's about 11,750 years ago. That's when I think the shrine that we call the Sphinx today was built. That's when I think the Great Pyramid was built. They looked at the stars. They observed the stars, probably. And in their most important spiritual tales, they equated them to the human story on Earth. The Great Pyramid and the Sphinx were built roughly 11,750 years ago. Hope you thought that was interesting, and you all have a very nice day.